The commissary smelled like burnt synthetic protein and institutional resignation. Proctor Havoc Soren had walked through Commissary Block 9 412 times across 19 cycles of trial observation. He knew its smell the way he knew the memorial wall's silence, completely, and without comfort. Recycled atmosphere, synthetic paste warming in sealed containers. The faint metallic undertone of a ventilation system that had been cleaning the same air since before he was assigned here. He did not know the smell of roasted bird. 12 recruits were registered for severance protocol that morning. One of them was eating contraband. The human sat at the far table, alone, grease on her fingers, working through what appeared to be an entire roasted fowl with the focused attention of someone solving a problem. Not eating, solving. 4 hours before the most lethal institutional trial in Union defense history, recruit Lyra Casthan of Verdes 7 was eating a hot meal she had smuggled past 17 security checkpoints, and she looked like someone who had checked a routine item off a list. Havoc's middle left sensory tendril began, very slowly, to twitch. He stood in the doorway for 6 full seconds. He had 19 cycles of trial monitoring experience. He had watched Korath warriors vomit from fear in this room. He had watched Sethran recruits sit motionless for 8 hours in pre-trial meditation, not eating, not sleeping, burning their bodies' stores down to nothing before the first chamber door opened. He had watched a Vesh cadet from cohort 30, 1C, spend her final pre-trial hours pressing her crystalline forehead against the commissary wall, humming her home hive resonance into the metal as if the station itself might answer. He had never watched someone eat chicken. The regulations technically did not forbid outside food. He checked this mentally and confirmed it. The regulations did not forbid it because no species in the Institute's 200-year history had ever wanted it. The commissary block's intake protocols assumed recruits would be too frightened to eat anything, let alone something they had prepared themselves and transported in sealed pouches across 3 security checkpoints. She had apparently brought 4 pouches. What happened next inside that trial, stage by stage, I still can't file it as standard. Stay close. Havoc crossed the commissary. He was not entirely sure why. His official role was observational, monitor, record, report. Not intervene, not engage. But something in the pattern of what he was seeing refused to process correctly, and 19 cycles had taught him that when a pattern refused to process, you walked toward it. She looked up when he was 3 meters away. Brown eyes, which he had noted from her file. Faint burn scars along the left forearm, which he had also noted. A small biodegradable pouch sitting open beside the bird, and inside it, rectangular bars wrapped in film, faintly visible seed clusters pressed into their surface. They smelled, even from here, of sweetened grain. She did not look surprised to see a proctor. She looked the way someone looks when they expected the interruption, but decided to let it arrive on its own schedule. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Recruit Casthan." He stopped. He was aware his mandibles had opened slightly in the Treshik expression that corresponded to involuntary confusion. "You are aware that severance protocol staging begins in 4 hours. 3 hours and 52 minutes, she said. "I know." She tore a piece from the bird and offered it toward him across the table. "You want some? It's cold now, but it reheats well enough." He stared at the offered piece for what was probably too long. "I do not want chicken." She shrugged, set it back on her own plate. "Your loss." A pause, easy and unhurried, the pause of someone between tasks rather than someone facing extinction. "Fear tastes worse than hunger anyway. I'd rather face whatever's in there full." Havoc filed that line, not officially. He just filed it. 19 cycles prior, Havoc Soren had transferred to Union Defense Institute Training Complex, Roman 4 orbital facility, as a junior observer with impeccable pattern recognition scores and a complete absence of operational experience. He had been assigned to the Severance Protocol Division because no senior proctor wanted it. The math was simple enough to be insulting. In 200 cycles, 3,847 recruits had entered Severance Protocol. 127 passed. 0 cohorts had ever survived intact. The survival rate held at 9% across species, across generations, across every tactical doctrine the Union had developed since the Institute's founding. The passing rate, recruits who survived all 7 stages and qualified for elite operations deployment, sat at 2.1%. Stage 1 alone had claimed 1,200 lives. Havoc had, on his 3rd day, walked the length of the Memorial Archive wall, brushed titanium, floor to ceiling, the names organized by species and then by cycle, engraved in characters 3 millimeters high. He had started at the Treshik section and had to stop when he reached the 217th name, which belonged to a proctor who had entered Stage 3 to recover a collapsed recruit and not come back out. The wall was 214 meters long. He had walked 48 of them. He did not walk the rest. He had understood by then that the wall was not a memorial. It was a doctrine. This is what happens here. This is what severance costs. Do not forget and do not expect otherwise. The memorial chapel held 3,847 engraved names. The last zero casualty run, a single recruit who had somehow navigated all 7 stages without losing consciousness, had occurred 183 cycles prior, and that recruit had still been alone. No cohort had ever brought every member through. This morning's cohort numbered 12. Havoc had reviewed their files the night before the way he reviewed every cohort, methodically, without hope, with the clinical detachment that 19 cycles had installed in him like a second layer of chitinous plating. He adjusted his monitoring display in the observation deck, running the same calibration he ran before every trial. Thermal sensors, biosignature tracking, the neural interface feeds from Stage 7. Routine. The 847th time, or close enough to it that the difference didn't matter. 12 names, 5 species. The Korath pair, Talok and his brother Dren, had applied together after their militia unit was absorbed into Union command. Talok was the larger of the two, which was saying something for a species whose average frame exceeded most doorways. He had a habit, noted in the psychological assessment, of cracking his knuckles before high-stress events. Havoc had already heard him twice from the corridor. The Vesh cadet was listed as Sarath 3 in Union Registry, though Vesh naming conventions didn't translate neatly into individual designation. Bioluminescent under stress, the file noted. Havoc had seen the pale blue glow dimming in and out from the observation window when Sarath 3 walked the corridor near the memorial wall. The light kept fading and returning, as if the recruit was breathing in the dark. The Sethran applicant, Riv, clipped to one syllable per her own preference, had folded her wings tight to her body since intake. Avian reptilian, hollow-boned, built for speed and altitude. The trial staging area had ceilings too low for flight. She had been walking with her shoulders rounded for 3 days. The Ulmer pair had arrived speaking only to each other. The remaining 4 recruits Havoc had noted as competent, frightened, and entirely likely to be eliminated in Stage 2, where the chasm lattice had a particular talent for separating recruits who thought they were brave from recruits who actually were. And then there was the human. Lyra Casthan's file listed her occupation as Agricultural Logistics Coordinator, Verdi's 7 frontier colony, 7 years of service managing crop distribution across a settlement where the atmospheric processors failed every 3rd season, and the backup protein farms were the difference between a colony surviving the winter and a colony not existing by spring. Her application to the Union Defense Institute cited, in the space marked Reason for Application, the following, Practical Curiosity. He had read that twice, then he had set the file down and gone to calibrate his display. She was the first human to apply to Severance Protocol in 11 cycles. The previous human applicant had been eliminated in Stage 1 without making it to the thermal cache. Humans were not a Deathworld species in the conventional classification. Verdi's 7 didn't appear on any Union threat registry, but their homeworld had joined the Coalition 34 cycles ago, and the species had a documented tendency to attempt things their physiological profile suggested they shouldn't. He understood that tendency less now that he had seen her eating chicken. He watched her from the observation corridor as she finished her meal methodically and began wrapping the remaining protein bars back into their pouches with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this packing many times. She sealed each one and slotted them into the pockets of her staging suit with practiced economy of motion. Then she gathered the remnants of her meal, disposed of them in the recycler, and wiped her hands on a cloth she produced from a 3rd pocket. She paused, then she turned toward the staging area entrance, where the other 11 recruits were already waiting, and she unwrapped one bar slowly, the scent of sweetened oats cutting through the scorched metal air of the corridor, and walked toward the trembling Vesh cadet and offered half. Sarath 3 stared at the offered piece. The bioluminescent glow flickered. A pause, 3 seconds, 4, and then a crystalline hand reached out and accepted it. Lyra said nothing. She ate her half standing beside the Vesh recruit, and the 2 of them stood together in the corridor outside the staging area, eating in silence, while Talok cracked his knuckles and Riv kept her wings folded, and the Ulmer pair murmured to each other in their own language, and Havoc stood at his observation window and felt something he couldn't yet classify moving through his analytical processing like a current through still water. Junior Proctor Kess appeared at his elbow. Kess was 4 cycles out of training, nervous enough that his reptilian scales had been running pale for 3 days and constitutionally unable to stop asking questions. Should we intervene? The food item. It's technically not. It is technically not prohibited, Havoc said, but the regulation assumed correctly for 200 cycles that no recruit would want food. He did not look away from the window. The regulation did not account for this. Kess was quiet for a moment. Do you think it matters, the food? Havoc considered the question longer than it seemed to deserve. File the observation, he said. Note that the human recruit consumed outside provisions and distributed a portion to a fellow recruit prior to trial initiation. Note that the behavior was not prohibited. Do not characterize it. What characterization would you have used? He finally looked away from the window. I don't have one yet. Commandant Drex Haller entered the staging area at the 90-second warning tone, which was when Havoc returned to the observation deck and brought his monitoring display to full resolution. Haller was Ulmer, amphibious, smooth-skinned, with the gill slits along his throat that opened and closed slightly when he was suppressing emotion. He had a scar that ran from his left jaw to his collarbone, where a thermal burst in Stage 3 had caught him 40 cycles ago. He had been a recruit himself, once. He had made it to Stage 4 before his cohort was gone, and the math of solo survival stopped adding up in his favor. He had survived, he had not passed. He ran the trial now. Recruits. His voice was unhurried and carried the specific weight of a person who had said difficult things for a long time. 12 of you entered this facility. The severance protocols will proceed through 7 stages. Your objective in each stage is completion. Your individual performance metrics will be assessed against 200 cycles of comparative data. No species in Union history has brought every member of a cohort through this trial intact. He paused, not for effect, just a pause. I tell you this not to discourage you, but because the memorial wall in Archive 3 tells you regardless. I prefer you to hear it from me first. Taluk cracked his knuckles once, precisely, on the last syllable. Lyra was looking at the floor. Or rather, and this was the detail that filed itself in Havoc's memory without his permission, she was looking at the floor the way someone looks at something they've already made a decision about. Not defeated, not calculating, decided. Stage 1 initiates in 90 seconds, Haller said. Good luck. He said it the way people say things they don't believe will matter. The staging area's primary chamber sealed. Havoc had watched this moment 846 times, and the sound was always the same. The deep, resonant lock of pressure-sealed doors, the hiss of atmospheric separation, and then silence on the monitoring feed for exactly 7 seconds before Stage 1's environmental systems activated. 7 seconds of silence, then the heat. The scorching vaults were Stage 1's official designation, and they had a procedural simplicity that Havoc had always found almost elegant in its cruelty. The chamber heated to 92 degrees Celsius across a 17-minute window. Thermal protection suits were hidden behind acoustic panels in the chamber's upper ring. 12 panels, 12 suits. Enough for everyone if the recruits cooperated, enough for approximately 4 if they competed. The Institute's 200 years of behavioral data showed that recruits competed, always. The suit distribution problem was the first psychological pressure point, designed to establish immediately that resources were scarce, that other recruits were obstacles, and that the fastest and most aggressive individuals would survive longest. 311 recruits had died in Stage 1 because they had been stripped of their suits by stronger competitors, or had abandoned injured partners to secure their own suit first, or had made it to a panel and found it already open and empty. The expected behavior was scatter. Lyra stood motionless for 40 seconds. Havoc noted the count. He had never recorded a recruit standing still for 40 consecutive seconds in Stage 1. The heat was climbing, 31 degrees now, rising, and the other recruits were already moving. Taluk went straight for the nearest acoustic panel, which was the instinctive correct choice and also the wrong one, because the nearest panel was a decoy, empty, its suit already removed and sealed in a secondary cache 3 panels clockwise. The Ulmer pair split toward opposite walls. Riv went up, not flying, just climbing, her hollow bones making the wall brackets easy, scanning from height. Lyra listened, her head tilted maybe 2 degrees to the left. Her eyes were not scanning the panels. Her eyes were tracking the ceiling vents. Havoc pulled the thermal overlay on his display and watched what she was apparently hearing. The air circulation pattern, which was not uniform, because the cache location behind the real panels was slightly warmer than the decoy locations, and the circulation system was pulling marginally more heat from those sectors. She had identified the cache location by listening to the airflow. 39 seconds standing still. Then she moved, not running, but with the directed efficiency of someone who already knew where they were going. She reached the correct cluster of panels, opened 3 in sequence, extracted the suits, turned, and began distributing. Not keeping one for herself first, distributing. Taluk stopped at his empty decoy panel, turned, and saw her holding a suit out toward him across 8 meters of increasingly hot air. His expression, the Korath expression, heavy brow and jaw, triple-jointed hands clenching, cycled through something Havoc couldn't fully read from the external feed. Not gratitude, not quite. Something more like recalibration. Havoc's mandibles clicked. 1, 2, 3. She's creating competition, he thought first. No, she's creating debtors. No. He revised again, and the revision was the one that made his tendril twitch harder. She's creating a team out of people who came here to survive alone. He typed into his notation log. Stage 1, Minute 7. Human recruit located thermal cache via atmospheric analysis. Distributed suits sequentially without securing own first. This unit requires observation. The last suit she handed out was to Serath 3, whose bioluminescent glow had gone almost white with stress. Then Lyra Casthon took the final suit, the 13th, the spare, the one the trial designers had included as a cruelty, because sometimes the math of 12 recruits and 12 suits seemed like it worked until someone counted wrong, and pulled it on while the temperature hit 56 degrees. 12 suits, 12 recruits. The scorching vaults had never produced that outcome before, not once. Havoc checked his historical data twice. Then, from the feed, clearly audible through the monitoring system, most species panic when the walls heat up. Lyra's voice, matter of fact, adjusting her suit seal with the particular focused attention she brought to everything. Humans just wonder if this is why their ancestors invented shade. The Koreth Taluk made a sound. It took Havoc a moment to classify it. Laughter. Short, involuntary, startled out of him like something that hadn't expected to be there. Medical Officer Thane materialized at the edge of the observation deck, all 6 arms crossed in the configuration that meant he was suppressing professional skepticism. He had been a medic for 30 cycles, and he had treated Stage 1 survivors with burns covering 40% of their surface area. He looked at the thermal feeds showing 12 stable body temperatures and said nothing. His arms stayed crossed. Stage 2 opened 8 minutes after Stage 1 sealed. The chasm lattice, a chamber 300 meters from floor to ceiling, the floor below visible only as a dark grid through the grating, the platforms connected by cables and improvised bridging materials the recruits were expected to locate and use. The objective was crossing. The implicit objective was arriving alone, faster than everyone else, establishing individual capability scores that would determine post-trial deployment ranking. The platforms swayed. Havoc watched Lyra stand at the first platform edge and look down for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked at the configuration of platforms and cables and began, very quietly, talking to the group. Not commanding, consulting. She asked Riv, the Sethran recruit, to do a pass overhead and identify where the cable attachment points were weakest, where the bridging materials had been left. Riv looked at her for a moment that carried the specific weight of a decision being made, then unfolded her wings 3/4 open and went. "You're slowing everyone's individual score down," Taluk said. It wasn't hostile, it was honest. He cracked one knuckle precisely on the last word. "Speed without survivors is just expensive failure," Lyra said. "If you want to go alone, go. I'm not stopping anyone." Nobody went alone. Riv returned with the information. Lyra mapped the safest route, not the fastest, the safest, and sent the smallest recruits first, with the strongest positioned on the platforms they'd cross last, distributing weight across the bridging cables in a sequence that kept the total load under the structural tolerance. The 2 smallest recruits had gaps they couldn't jump. Lyra and Taluk bridged them without discussion, 1 on each side, and the recruits crossed between them. The crossing took 11 minutes longer than the Stage 2 speed record. All 12 made it. Havoc noted the time and added below it, "No individual performance score for this cohort can be meaningfully assessed by current metrics. Current metrics assume solo completion. Recommend flagging for review." He did not send the recommendation. He wasn't sure to whom it should go. He filed it in his private notation system instead and watched Stage 3's environmental systems begin their initialization cycle on the secondary feed. The kill grid, automated defense drones, plasma turrets calibrated for solo target acquisition, environmental traps distributed across the stage floor in patterns that rewarded individual evasion speed. Havoc had seen the kill grid eliminate entire cohorts. He had seen it eliminate 6 recruits simultaneously when a group had clustered too close to a turret's acquisition cone. The trial designers had not, in 200 years, ever needed to consider what 12 recruits moving in coordinated formation would look like to a targeting system calibrated for individual signatures. He was about to find out. Lyra distributed the protein bars before the door opened. She did it without announcement, just produced them from her staging suit pockets while the group waited in the transition chamber, and passed them along with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been feeding people in difficult conditions for a long time. Taluk took his and ate the entire thing in one bite, looked at the empty wrapper in his massive hand with an expression that Havoc's analytical processing couldn't immediately categorize, something between surprise and acknowledgement. He folded the wrapper carefully and tucked it into his own pocket. The door opened. The kill grid's turrets initialized with the specific high-pitched cycling tone That meant targeting systems were active. 12 biosignatures entering the chamber simultaneously produced a processing conflict in the turret network. They were calibrated for individual evasion patterns, and 12 people moving in coordinated formation didn't match any behavioral profile in their database. The system cycled through threat assessment for 4 seconds. 4 seconds of stillness, while a 200-year-old automated defense network tried to decide what it was looking at. Lyra used the 4 seconds. She read the turret positions, called out the attack interval, 4.3-second cycle, listened for the pitch drop, and set the group moving in the sequence that kept them inside the dead zones between acquisition sweeps. The Korath twins got pinned behind a pressure barrier at the grid's midpoint, where a turret had acquired them specifically. Havoc watched Lyra reach into her suit's interior pocket and produce a device the size of her palm. Civilian-grade signal jammer, the kind used on frontier colonies to protect atmospheric processing equipment from wildlife interference signals. It was definitively contraband. It was also definitively effective. The turret's targeting signal scrambled for 11 seconds, long enough for both Korath to clear the barrier. She had smuggled a signal jammer through 17 security checkpoints. The regulations did not technically forbid signal jammers either. Havoc checked. They didn't, because no recruit had ever thought to bring one. The trial expected predators, he said quietly to his empty observation deck. It got a pack that had already decided dying alone was the only unacceptable outcome. He was not sure when he had started saying things out loud. All 12 recruits cleared the kill grid. 3 minor thermal burns, all treated with the basic medpack the trial provided, nothing requiring extraction. Havoc filed Stage 3's completion data and noted without elaboration that the signal jammer's use had technically been within protocol parameters. He would let the review committee argue about that. Stage 4 was already initializing. The submersion puzzle, a chamber that flooded with caustic liquid over a 9-minute window, during which recruits were required to solve a multi-lock sequential puzzle submerged. The caustic solution was non-lethal at standard concentrations, but would cause progressive sensory impairment if sustained contact exceeded 40 seconds of unprotected skin exposure. The puzzle required sustained cognitive function under physical stress and time pressure. The Stage 4 casualty record listed 219 names, most from panic-induced errors in the puzzle sequence that extended submersion time past the critical threshold. The chamber flooded. Sarah 3 began hyperventilating in the first 30 seconds of rising liquid. The bioluminescent glow strobing rapidly, crystalline body rigid, breath coming in short bursts that were burning through oxygen reserves at 3 times the sustainable rate. Havoc watched the biometric display and calculated. At the current respiratory rate, the Vesh recruit would lose functional consciousness in 4 minutes, well before the puzzle could be completed. Then he heard it through the monitoring feed. Low, rhythmic, slightly muffled by the liquid rising around her chest. Lyra was humming. It was not music exactly. It was a work rhythm, the kind of cadence Havoc had read about in agricultural documentation, the beat patterns that frontier colony laborers used during long processing cycles to maintain synchronized effort across teams. Regular, unrushed, absolutely deliberate. The sound traveled through the liquid in a way that cut through the chamber's ambient noise. And one by one, the recruits began to sync their breathing to it without anyone telling them to, the way breathing synchronizes to rhythm without conscious decision. Sarah 3 strobing slowed, one cycle of the melody, then another. The hyperventilation became controlled breathing. The bioluminescent light steadied. The puzzle required 14 sequential actions across 6 locks, coordinated across 12 recruits in 3 clusters. They worked through it, not quickly, not gracefully, some stumbling, 2 recruits requiring physical steadying from Talok when the liquid hit their chins, and the instinct to surface overrode cognition. Lyra kept humming through the entirety of it. The final lock opened with 22 seconds of breathable air remaining. 12 recruits surfaced through the extraction hatch into the transition corridor, coughing and dripping, and in Talok's case, shaking in a way his broad frame made almost invisible. Almost. Havoc noticed it. The monitors showed all 12 biosignatures stable. Havoc sat back in his observation chair and became aware that his middle left tendril had been twitching continuously since Stage 1. He stilled it deliberately, filed the Stage 4 data, noted the respiratory synchronization tactic in his private log with the notation, previously undocumented. Recommend literature review for comparable behavioral precedent. There was no comparable behavioral precedent. He knew this without doing the review. Stage 5 was already cycling. The isolation spheres, complete sensory deprivation, individual sealed chambers, 18-minute psychological collapse threshold for the average recruit across all species. 847 recruits had entered Stage 5's isolation chambers. 631 had been extracted non-functional. Havoc pulled up Stage 5's historical data. He studied it for a moment. Then he looked at the transition corridor monitor, where Talok, who had carried 3 recruits across a gap in the chasm lattice, who had held the shield position in the kill grid for 11 minutes without moving, was standing with his shaking hands pressed flat against the corridor wall, trying to make them stop. The isolation chambers were next. The Korath warriors' shaking hands pressed harder against the wall. Havoc looked at Lyra. She had noticed too. She was already moving toward Talok, not quickly, the way you move toward something you don't want to startle. He watched her say something too quiet for the audio to catch clearly. Watched Talok's jaw set in the Korath expression that usually preceded refusal. What she said next stopped the refusal before it arrived. Havoc couldn't hear it. The audio feed wasn't close enough. He watched Talok's expression cycle through something complex and land somewhere different than it had started. And then the staging door for Stage 5 opened, and 12 recruits walked in, and the isolation chambers sealed around each of them with the sound of 12 individual locks engaging in sequence. 12 locks. Havoc checked Stage 5's neural stability thresholds and felt something he was only willing to describe, in his private log, as professional uncertainty. Havoc pulled up Stage 5's neural stability data while the isolation chamber locks were still cycling, and the number he was looking for, 631, sat at the top of the historical extract like a fact that had never felt relevant until now. 631 recruits extracted non-functional from Stage 5 across 200 cycles. Not dead, non-functional. The distinction mattered to the Institute's record-keeping, and to approximately no one else. He looked at the monitoring feed for Chamber 7, where Talok's biometrics were already showing elevated cortisol equivalents, the Korath stress hormone spiking in the particular pattern that Stage 5's intake documentation called pre-collapse trajectory. The warrior who had carried 2 recruits across the chasm gap and held a turret acquisition cone for 11 minutes was now sealed alone in a meter-wide sphere of absolute silence, and his hands, Havoc was certain, were still shaking. The question arrived before Havoc could stop it. Did she know this would happen to him? He pulled Lyra's pre-trial file again. Agricultural Logistics Coordinator. 7 years of managing colony survival under resource scarcity. He looked at her Chamber 4 biometrics, steady, almost meditative, respiration controlled, and then looked back at Talok's trajectory and understood, with a clarity that arrived the way unwelcome truths tend to, that she had known exactly what isolation would cost the Korath warrior. She had seen it in his hands in the transition corridor. She had moved toward him quietly. She had said something too quiet for the audio feed. Whatever she had said, his biometrics showed it was still working. Barely, but working. Havoc filed the chamber data and permitted himself one notation, in his private log, that he would later revise 4 times before it said what he meant. Human recruit demonstrates predictive care, not reactive response to crisis, but anticipatory preparation for it. Previously unclassified leadership behavior. He watched the 18-minute clock on Stage 5 begin its count. 14 minutes and 7 seconds after isolation began, Chamber 4's lock disengaged. Lyra then stepped out into the transition staging area alone, which was technically a violation of Stage 5's sequential release protocol. Havoc reached for the override panel to flag it. Then he didn't. He watched instead. She walked directly to Chamber 7, and placed one hand flat against its surface. She couldn't speak to Talok through the ceiling. The chambers were acoustically dead, but she stood there with her palm against the metal and waited, and at the 13-second mark, Talok's cortisol equivalent stopped climbing. It didn't drop, it stopped. That was, by Stage 5's documented behavioral parameters, not supposed to be possible from outside. At 18 minutes and 41 seconds past the threshold where 631 recruits had gone non-functional, Chamber 7's lock disengaged. Talok came out still shaking, but upright, both eyes clear. He looked at her hand against the chamber wall. He looked at her face. He said something in Korath that Havoc's translation system rendered as roughly, "You stayed." "Always planned to," she said. "Stage 6 needs you." He cracked one knuckle. Precisely. Then he straightened to his full height, which brought the top of his head to within 4 centimeters of the corridor ceiling, and said, "Then let's not waste it." All 12 chambers disengaged within 4 minutes of that exchange. Havoc recorded the Stage 5 completion with the notation, 0 non-functional extractions. No precedent in record. No comparable precedent in adjacent literature review, flagging for committee review. He did not believe the committee review would produce a useful framework. But the notation was required. Kess materialized at his elbow again, scales still pale. Havoc, the Predator Zone. He was holding a datapad with both hands. Stage 6. I've been looking at the design specifications. I know what Stage 6's specifications are. The apex predators. There are 23 species represented across the zone. The pack instinct species, specifically the Drathhound cluster, the Kelevar colony organism, they were fitted with aggression limiters. But the pack behavior was left intact because the designers assumed the recruits would be solo, and the pack behavior would add environmental pressure. Kess paused. Nobody ever put a coordinated group of 12 in there. Havoc looked at him, and the Kelevar colony organism's pack behavior responds to hierarchical group structure. It recognizes alpha formation. If the 12 recruits move with clear internal hierarchy, the colony organism may read them as a competing pack rather than as prey. Havoc turned back to the monitoring feed. On it in the transition corridor, Lyra was already talking. Her hands were moving in the particular efficient geometry she used when she was allocating resources. The same motion, Havoc realized, that she had probably used for 7 years distributing crops across a struggling colony. Riv had her wings half extended. Talok and Dren were positioning. She had reached the same conclusion Kess had just reached, by a different route, approximately 4 minutes earlier. File your observation, Havoc said, retroactively. Date it before Stage 6 initiates. The Predator Zone covered 3 square kilometers of imported biome, engineered jungle. The temperature calibrated to match the Kelevar colony organism's preferred range. The canopy thick enough to block aerial surveillance, except for the monitoring system's embedded feeds. Stage 6's objective was distributed across the zone. 12 individual retrieval targets, each requiring a recruit to reach a specific coordinate and extract a data token. The design assumption was solo navigation, competition for safe routes, individual risk assessment against a 23-species apex predator distribution. The Kelevar colony organism weighed, collectively, 400 kilograms, and moved in a formation of between 8 and 40 individual bodies, depending on its threat assessment state. It had never encountered 12 recruits, moving as a single coordinated pack. Havoc watched from the overhead feed. Riv went up first, not into the high canopy, which would have separated her from the group, but to the first canopy level, wings half spread, catching thermal lift from the engineered heat gradient to stay aloft with minimal effort. From that position, she functioned as an aerial sweep, calling coordinates in the clipped, efficient Sethran cadence that carried clearly through the jungle noise. Talok and Dren moved as a forward wall, not charging, pacing, steady. The Korath warrior's full-height profile, multiplied by 2, read on every instinctive threat assessment system in the zone as something that required evaluation before aggression. The Drathhounds retreated from 3 encounters without contact. The Kelevar colony organism was different. It flowed toward the group's left flank from the 3rd tree line, 41 bodies moving in the liquid formation that the Stage 6 documentation called prey encirclement pattern. Havoc's monitoring feed showed it approaching on 3 of his 4 camera positions before the recruits were fully aware of its vector. Then Lyra stopped. She stopped and faced the approaching formation and held one hand up, palm out, not to the colony organism, to her own group, and stood still. The Kelevar paused at 60 meters. Its lead bodies raised the sensory clusters the species used for threat evaluation and scan. What they found was not 11 individuals clustered in panic. What they found was 12 entities holding formation, the largest 2 at the forward point, aerial scout overhead, clear hierarchical signal in every behavioral cue the Kelevar's instinct recognized. A competing pack, the colony organism recirculated for 11 seconds, the specific churning movement it used to rebuild internal consensus, and then withdrew to a parallel route, maintaining 60 meters of clearance, and did not approach again. Lyra lowered her hand. D2, she said, to no one in particular. Havoc did not know what she meant. He found out 30 seconds later when Kess, reading from the Stage 6 design documentation, said aloud, "The apex predators in Stage 6 were fitted with aggression limiters, but their pack structure remained. She didn't fight their nature. She mirrored it." The group retrieved 11 of 12 data tokens in 2 hours and 40 minutes. The 12th was at the deepest coordinate, which required passing through a sector where 3 Drathhounds had established a territorial perimeter and showed no sign of clearing it. Talok looked at the coordinate marker on his display and began to turn in that direction, alone, which was the Korath warrior's solution to all problems that required large amounts of force applied without backup. "No," Lyra said, one word, not loud, the kind of quiet that carries more weight than volume. Talok turned back. His expression was the one Havoc had been cataloging since Stage 2, the one that meant he was deciding whether his pride or his logic was going to win this particular argument. Pride had won several of them. Logic had won more and was winning with increasing frequency. "Together or not at all," Lyra said. That's been the plan since stage 1. Taluk cracked his knuckle, but he waited. Riv found the approach vector from overhead. The Ulmer pair handled the perimeter distraction. Ulmer chemical detection allowed them to see the Drathhound's territorial markers without contact, redirecting their patrol pattern. Taluk and Dren went in on the cleared approach. 63 seconds. The 12th token retrieve. 0 contact with the Drathhounds. All 12 objectives, 3 hours and 4 minutes. Havoc noted the record completion time, and then noted, below it, that the record was meaningless because no previous Stage 6 completion had involved collective retrieval. He was writing new parameters with every notation he filed. He was not sure whether to find this alarming or something else. Stage 7 was initializing. This was the moment Havoc had been dreading since he pulled Lyra's file. The breaking threshold used neural interface technology developed by Keth Corporation, the same technology the Union Defense Institute's Oversight Committee had debated removing from the severance protocol for 3 consecutive review cycles, and kept, every time, because its psychological pressure data was considered operationally relevant. The system read a recruit's personal file, cross-referenced with biometric stress response data, and built a simulation constructed from the recruit's specific attachments. Not generic fear scenarios, not standardized nightmares. The things that actually mattered to each recruit, dismantled in front of them. Havoc had pulled Lyra's file 40 minutes earlier. He knew what the system would find. Verdes 7, the frontier colony where she had coordinated logistics for 7 years. The settlement that had nearly failed twice under atmospheric processor failure, that had survived because people like her had managed the resource distribution precisely enough that the math stayed on the right side of survivable. Her younger brother, listed as agricultural technician, currently stationed at the colony's primary greenhouse complex. Her parents, both colony founders. The burn scar on her left forearm from a childhood incident in that same greenhouse. The neural interrogation system would take those and make them ash. It had done it to 800 recruits in Stage 7. It would do it to a woman who had just carried 11 people through 6 stages of extinction-level trial design by treating hunger as more dangerous than fear. And it was going to reach directly into everything she had left behind to come here and tell her, in her own voice, that she had made a terrible mistake. His tendril was twitching hard enough that he pressed it flat against his sensory array. The chamber doors sealed. Havoc watched the biometric displays for 12 recruits enter Stage 7's neural interface range, felt the monitoring system sync with the Keth Corporation interface, and for the first time in 19 cycles, looked away from the displays for a moment. Not long, 3 seconds. Then he looked back. Stage 7's displays for 11 of the 12 recruits showed standard induced fear escalation curves. Expected, normal, by Stage 7's deeply abnormal parameters. Lyra Casthan's display showed something the system had no categorical name for. Her fear response was not escalating. It was present, real, documented, the biometrics of genuine distress, not suppression. But it was not climbing. It was holding at a level that the neural interface should have been amplifying and wasn't, because the simulation kept presenting her nightmare, and something in her response pattern kept resisting amplification in a way the system's behavioral model didn't have a framework for. Havoc's private notation read later, Stage 7 AI flagged anomaly in simulation run for recruit Casthan. Neural interrogation scanned for fear of death. It found something stranger, fear of failing people who trusted her. System attempted standard amplification of attachment fear. Amplification stalled at 90 seconds. Cause unknown. Filing for review. Inside the simulation, though the monitoring feed couldn't show it directly, something was happening. The Keth Corporation interface had built Verdes 7's destruction in precise detail. The greenhouse burning, the atmospheric processors silent, the colony's population data showing the loss figures that Lyra's file indicated she had once spent 3 months trying to prevent. It had overlaid her brother's face. It had used her own voice to deliver the accusation that all of this was her fault for leaving. Lyra Casthan had stood in the middle of her rendered nightmare and said, calmly, into the simulation's constructed silence, "No, this isn't real, and even if it were, grief wouldn't honor them. Moving forward does." Then she had found the puzzle terminal. She solved it in 11 minutes while the simulation continued screaming around her. Not at her. She had, apparently, stopped receiving it as being directed at her somewhere around the 4-minute mark. She solved it methodically, the way she did everything, treating each lock sequence as a logistics problem with unacceptable failure parameters. All 12 recruits solved their puzzles. All 12 neural interfaces disengaged within 6 minutes of each other. All 12 recruits walked out of Stage 7's exit corridor together. Havoc stared at his display. 12 biosignatures converging on the extraction beacon's coordinate. All green, every indicator nominal. No trauma extraction required. No medical intervention codes triggered. 12 stable biosignatures where the historical record showed, at best, 1 or 2 survivors coming out non-functional. His middle left tendril stopped twitching. It didn't slow down. It stopped mid-motion, suspended, the way a machine stops when the input it was designed to process simply isn't there anymore. Kess had stopped breathing. Havoc noticed this peripherally, because Kess's own biosigns were visible in the edge of his peripheral sensory array, and the breathing pattern had gone to 0, which was not medically possible, and was actually just the particular stillness that very young observers produced when they encountered something they had no categorical response for. His scales had gone from pale to the pale gold that in reptilian species indicated suspended shock. Medical Officer Thane stood at his console with all 6 arms crossed, then uncrossed, then crossed again in a different configuration. He looked at the trauma bay readiness display, which showed 12 bays prepared and 0 bays needed, and his expression settled into something that Havoc's analytical processing classified as professional bewilderment. On the monitoring feed, in the final extraction chamber, Commandant Drex Haller straightened his collar. It was automatic, a reflex he had probably performed before every cohort briefing for 40 cycles, the small adjustment of a senior official about to speak. His gill slits opened and closed twice. The scar across his throat pulsed once, the deep tissue color shift that Ulmer physiology produced under suppressed emotional load. 12 recruits from 5 species stood in the extraction chamber in front of him. Talok had one arm across Lyra's shoulders, not draped casually, but with the specific weight of a Korath warrior placing a blood family claim, a gesture his culture reserved for individuals who had earned it in ways that transcended duty. Serath 3 bioluminescent glow was steady for the first time since intake, and the Vesh recruit was humming, low, rhythmic, the melody Lyra had used in Stage 4's submersion chamber, now passing through the room like something that had always belonged there. Riv's wings were folded around the 2 smallest recruits, a shelter gesture the Sethran used for nestling. The Ulmer pair stood in the configuration that Havoc's xenobiological reference indicated meant completed mission. Haller looked at them for 11 seconds. Havoc counted. "Congratulations," Haller said. One word. The word cost him something. It was visible in the gill-slit movement, in the particular set of his jaw, in the way his hand came up slightly and then didn't complete its motion. He had said this word to 127 recruits in 40 cycles. He had never said it to a complete cohort. Lyra surveyed each of them, Talok's shaking hands, steadied now by his own will and by the weight of her beside him. Serath 3 steadied light. The minor burns, the exhaustion, the particular quality of 12 people who had been pulled through the far edge of what they thought they could survive, and had come out the other side still attached to each other. She smiled, not triumph, not relief, the smile of someone exactly where they intended to be. "We made it," she said. Simple, factual, declarative, the sentence structure of someone reporting a logistics outcome. Havoc realized then what had been unsettling him since Stage 1. He had been trying to classify her tactics through the Institute's framework, individual performance scoring, competitive resource acquisition, survival optimization for a single biosignature. The framework kept producing error codes, because he was using the wrong template. She had not treated Severance Protocol as a gauntlet to survive. She had treated it as a logistics problem with unacceptable casualty projections. Then she had solved it. Later, in his Stage 7 anomaly report, filed 3 hours after the cohort's extraction, Havoc noted one additional item that he had almost omitted. The Keth Corporation Neural Interrogation System's internal log showed that Lyra Casthan's simulation had been the only one in Stage 7's operational history that the AI could not sustain past 90 seconds of amplification. The system had attempted standard escalation of attachment fear. The escalation had stalled. The AI had flagged the response pattern as anomalous input and filed it for review. The review was pending. Havoc did not know what the AI had found. He knew only that the system, designed over 40 years to identify and amplify the specific fear that would break a recruit most efficiently, had encountered something in her response that it had no model for, and had, effectively, given up. He filed this observation. He added a note that the observation required follow-up that exceeded his reporting authority. Then he closed the report and went to find the human. She was in the post-trial medical wing, in one of the standard recovery alcoves, drinking something hot from a container she had produced from what was apparently a 4th interior pocket nobody had found during intake processing. The bioluminescent healing tanks cast blue light across the walls. She looked in the way that people look after surviving something their body understood better than their mind, yet did. Precisely like a person who needed 2 days of sleep and had no intention of mentioning it. "Why?" Havoc asked. She looked at him, waited. "Why sacrifice individual performance scoring for collective outcome?" Every metric we use to assess this trial is built for individual performance. Your scores will be uncalculable. You've made yourself impossible to rank." She considered this. She took one more sip from her container. Then, because going fast alone means nothing if you arrive at a place where nobody knows your name. A pause. "I'd rather go slower with people who'll remember we walked together." He stood in the doorway of the recovery alcove for a moment that extended beyond what his reporting role technically required. Then he said, "Your Stage 7 anomaly has been flagged for Keth Corporation review." "I know." She said this without concern, which was either supreme confidence or something he was going to have to develop new categories for. "The system couldn't amplify your fear response. It was trying to use Verdes 7, she said. "My brother, the greenhouse. But I've already decided those things matter enough to come back to. Fear only works on what you're not sure about yet." He filed this in his private notation system, and was not entirely certain which category to put it in. Commandant Haller addressed the assembled Institute faculty 3 hours after the cohort's extraction, in the main briefing auditorium, with no advance notice, and a prepared statement that his administrative aide later described as written by hand, twice, because the first draft had an error, and he doesn't use automated drafting for documents he considers significant. He announced formation of an experimental operations unit, unified cohort deployment, maintaining the 12-member composition, field coordinator, recruit Casthan, effective immediately upon medical clearance. Proctor Havoc Soren filed his official report the following morning. The notation that took him longest to write was 2 sentences. Human recruit demonstrated tactical altruism, previously theoretical behavioral concept in operational context. Recommend formal revision of individualist competition doctrine underlying current severance protocol design. He sent it to the review committee, the doctrine assessment board, and with some consideration, directly to Haller's office. Medical Officer Thane discharged 12 patients with minor injury classification only. He stood in the empty trauma bay afterward and looked at 12 unused critical response kits, and said nothing for approximately 4 minutes. He later submitted a personnel request for 2 additional junior medics, and separately, a request to study human physiological stress response patterns, which he described in the request form as operationally relevant. Junior Proctor Kess requested reassignment to human tactical psychology research. The request was approved within 48 hours. The 12 recruits chose their unit designation themselves, collectively, in the recovery wing. They voted the only formal vote the unit would ever take, and the result was unanimous. The provisions. Kess asked Lyra later where the name had come from. She said it was Talok's idea. When asked, Talok said it had been Serath 3 idea. When the record was reviewed, nobody could trace it with certainty, which was, Havoc noted in a final private notation, entirely consistent with how the unit had operated from the beginning. 3 weeks after cohort extraction, the provisions deployed on their first operational mission, humanitarian extraction from a contested moon, with a Union command projection of 40% casualty probability. Havoc was not assigned to that mission's oversight. He received the debrief summary through standard channels 5 days later. Actual casualties, 0. The report included a footnote from enemy forces' own post-engagement documentation, intercepted by Union intelligence. Withdrew citing unpredictable human coordination doctrine. Recommend threat reassessment. 6 months later, the Union Defense Institute's Oversight Committee formally voted to redesign severance protocol. The new framework introduced collaborative objective structures, shared survival metrics, and what the official documentation called distributed resilience assessment. Survival rate rose from 9% to 34% in the first cycle. Passing rate climbed from 2.1% to 12%. Commandant Haller ordered the memorial wall expanded, not for new dead, for the 127 previous survivors, whose names had been kept only in the Institute's administrative records, because the memorial had been designed to honor only those who fell. He ordered each name transferred to a new section of the wall, brushed titanium, same material, same 3mm character height, with the notation completed. Not survived, not outlasted, completed. Lyra attended the dedication ceremony. She stood in front of the new section of the wall for a long time. Havoc watched from the corridor entrance, not intending to interrupt, until she turned and saw him, and waved him over in the manner of someone who had noticed him some time ago and decided to wait. In the ceremony hall afterward, she reached into the pocket of her formal uniform, the 4th one, the one nobody found, and produced the last protein bar from her original batch. The biodegradable wrapper was slightly creased at one corner. The seed clusters were visible through the film, the faint honey and grain scent still there despite the weeks between. She held it out to Commandant Haller. He looked at it for a moment. His gill slits opened once. Then he took it, and the wrapper crinkled as it passed between their hands, the sound small and specific, and somehow carrying more weight than the formal speeches that had preceded it. "Something to remember," she said. "That fear tastes worse than hunger." Haller looked at the bar in his hand, then at her. His scar was still. His gill slits closed slowly. He said nothing because the Ulmer, in their own cultural tradition, considered silence the most honest response to a statement that required no addition. He put the bar in his pocket, somewhere on Verdes 7, in the greenhouse where the atmospheric processors hummed reliably now, because someone had finally fixed the third-season fault. Lyra's younger brother pressed his hands into the soil of the growing beds at the start of a new planting cycle. The burn scar on his left forearm was older than hers and shaped differently, from a different childhood incident in the same building, under the same glass panels that filtered the colony's light into the growing rows. He smoothed the soil flat, checked the moisture readings, adjusted the drainage channel by 2 degrees. Outside the greenhouse panels, the colony's morning light came through at the angle that meant the processors were running clean. He began the work of tending what had been planted.